This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by New Relic and Epsagon. This week, I chat with Angela Timofte about what to do with your data in a serverless world. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 79. Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Daly and this is Serverless Chats. Today I'm speaking with Angela Timofte. Hey Angela, thanks for joining me.
Hi Jeremy, thanks for having me here.
So you are the data platform manager at Trustpilot. So I would love it if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at Trustpilot and what Trustpilot is all about.
Yes, of course. So as you already mentioned, I work as a data platform manager at Trustpilot, and I've been with the company for almost 6 years. So quite a long period of time for a company that it's only been for like 11 years on the market. But yeah, I started in the company as a backend developer and then moved to be more of a full stack developer. And now I'm the data platform manager because my love for data was always there. And I kind of did everything that I could to move closer to the data. To be honest, no matter where I was in my career, it was always data that like attracted me the most. Like, how do you handle it? And to be honest, nowadays, like data is everything. Like you can't take any decision as a business without data. And now everyone is seeing that, so it's really cool the position I am right now because I can push all these like data analytics that we do, so that we take like the right decision. And then yeah, Trustpilot. I mean, hopefully everyone heard about Trustpilot. At least that's what I want to think. But in case you haven't, you should use it. It's an online review platform, and I mean our whole mission is to help people to have better experiences when it comes to purchasing online. But of course, at the same time, we want to help businesses to connect with their customers and also improve their offerings. And for that, we offer all these analytics tools, so they understand better their customers and they know where they need to improve their business. I mean, if you think about like the situation now with COVID, honestly, Trustpilot came perfectly, even for me. Like I'm talking from my perspective now, but like I had to order everything online, like from food to like toilet paper. I didn't go to the store to fight for it. I went online and fought for it. So, but it came super handy because I'm based in Copenhagen and we don't have Amazon here, and then you have to purchase from like smaller businesses and you don't know about all of them. So I found myself searching on Trustpilot. Okay, can I trust this business because I've never heard about it, right? So I don't want to throw money out there. And yeah, that's what you can use Trustpilot for if you are a consumer. And especially in these times, it's perfect because I can trust that what I find there, it's real data and real people, and I can get their opinions on all of this. So yeah.
Awesome. So I am super excited to have you here because as much as I am a huge serverless geek, I love data. Like I'm with you on that. Like everything that I do, I'm always finding better ways to build or abstract data or interact with data. I built all these libraries, open source libraries. I think all my open source libraries have something to do with data. And what we've seen over the last several years is this move to more and more serverless data, right? Like capabilities that allow us to use databases that are more and more serverless. DynamoDB obviously being one of the big ones, all kinds of crazy stuff happening with relational databases. So You're an expert on databases and data, and I would love to get some of your, sort of your comments and insight on what are those choices that people have right now for serverless data. And also, we're in the middle of reInvent right now. So just in the beginning of reInvent, there's already a whole bunch of announcements of new things that Amazon has released and more options that are available. So let's start there. What are those serverless options for data that people have?
Yeah, so I mean, you've already mentioned DynamoDB, and for me, that's like the first choice when it comes to building serverless applications, to be honest, especially when you think about scaling. That's my first pick. And then Aurora, and yeah, now we have Aurora Serverless too. Let's see
Right.
what we can do with that one, right? Super excited to see more about the version 2. And then, yeah, you can use S3 Kinesis, and they've released some other things now for databases like Babelfish to like
Right.
export data, and yeah, then you had what was it called, the Glue as well,
Oh
the
yeah,
Glue
glue
Elastic
elastic
Views.
views. Yeah.
Yes, which will actually replace some of the pipelines that I have, probably with like all the DynamoDB streams going to Lambda, then going to Elasticsearch and so on. So probably that will change some of the things that I've done previously. Um, but yeah, when it comes to databases and serverless, I know, like, especially before, I don't know if it's still the case, but when people were mentioning serverless, was always like Lambda functions and containers and things like that, but no one was talking about databases. And I think it's a huge mistake, because I mean, no matter how scalable you make like your services, if your database is not scalable, then like you're missing the point, right? um,
Right. Right.
and yeah, and that's why I think it's super important to look at these serverless databases, so that you make your entire pipeline scalable from one end to another. And that's where, yeah, DynamoDB uh, comes super handy.
Right. So with DynamoDB, I think if people don't know what DynamoDB is, just go and look it up. It's an amazing key value store, document database. You can do some really cool things with that. But it does have limitations in terms, especially if you're building like OLAP applications, right? Because you can't do all these different queries, you can't slice and dice the data different ways. So beyond DynamoDB being a very good sort of, I look at it as a perfect application or a perfect database for your front end users that need to access data quickly, where the access patterns are very consistent and you know what those are going to be. But when you have to start exploring data more, or you've got relational things that need to be done, what are some of the options there? You mentioned Aurora serverless, right? So let's dig into that a little bit, and then let's talk about V2, because that's kind of exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on Dynamo, the way that we use it is, as you mentioned, it's for our front application, right? So that they are scaling accordingly, and also that everything gets like pre-calculated, and the way that you store,
Right.
like, you need to be very strict when you store your data in Dynamo, so that you actually take the benefits out of Dynamo. Otherwise, yeah, don't just throw data there and hope for the best.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, then like you can go to Aurora Servlets. The thing with the Aurora Servlets, at least version 1, we don't use it as much because of some of the limitations that you have with the Aurora Servlets. And one big one for us, at least, was that you can't import from S3.
Right.
And that's, I know, I can't remember at what conference I complained about that, but I know I complained about it when people from AWS were there. I was like, I need these people. And also the pricing on Aurora Serverless is quite high. But of course, when I mention pricing, like, even if you go to Dynamo, which is much cheaper, you need to calculate like how much time, like development times, it takes you to put things in Dynamo, for instance, or like for people to actually understand, because it might not be so easy to do things in Dynamo. And then, yeah, with Aurora serverless, unfortunately, we don't use it as much. But that's why I'm super curious now with version 2, which seems that they are investing more into the serverless version of Aurora, and hopefully they will work more on it so that we can use it in more like heavy productionized workflows, because before it felt like it's not really for your heavy workflows, I would say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the scaling characteristics of version 1 was this doubling of capacity where it actually had to like move data between instances, and it took like a minute to scale up, and it just wasn't one of those things where it was as elastic as you wanted it to be. V2, very, very promising. It's very cool because the instances themselves scale, which is kind of crazy, and it will just. And I did a bunch of tests the other day, or last night actually, and just I threw as much as I could at the thing, and it just laughed at me. I mean, it was like, nah, no problem. And then the other cool thing is, according to the website, it says it's going to have all the features of Aurora, so that should mean S3 imports and global tables and all these other things. They actually said there would be global tables, so that could be really, really cool.
I hope
Twice
they
the
listen.
price, though. Yeah, I know. Twice the price, though, as the V1. I did some calculations on it, though. I mean, it still might be cheaper, depending on your workloads, and they say it's 90% cheaper. But anyways, I think that's a super interesting option. All right, the other thing you mentioned was S3. And I don't think a lot of people think of S3 as a database, but if you store data in S3, you've got a lot of options, right?
Yeah, it's actually right that people don't think as S3 as a data store, and it's also that it's been there for so long, and all these other new cool have appeared. I feel like people forgot about S3 and how powerful it is and how flexible it is. And I think the problem with S3, it just doesn't come to your mind as like a data store. Like how would you go about? But it's very flexible once you start using it, and it's the same as with Dynamo. It might take a bit of time to like actually adjust to how you take your data, but I think it's a very powerful tool that people forget about. So yeah.
Right, and there's a bunch of interfaces into it as well. I mean, you can use S3 Select, so like on really large files, you can select just a portion of them. So basically, you can query a file or an object within S3, and then you've got Athena, right? So what are your thoughts on Athena?
We're actually not using Athena as an yeah, I know. So I can't really say much on like production work because we don't use it. That's my take on Athena. Well, we don't use it.
That's it. Well, I mean, I think the funny thing is that, I mean, with as large of as a footprint that Trustpilot has and all the different services you're using, I mean, again, it's impossible probably to use all of these services, right? So you just have to pick the ones that actually work for you. But Athena, I mean, what I love about Athena is just the fact that you map over these S3 buckets and you can query it like normal SQL, which I mean is sort of, and gives you the performance of something like maybe BigQuery. Like what about things like BigQuery or Azure CosmosDB or things like that? Have you played around with any of those?
Yeah, so the reason why we don't use Athena is because we use BigQuery. Yeah, it's very powerful, and that's what we use to analyze all of our data and pre-compute everything, and then we push it back to the AWS space, where we then use it in Dynamo or like any other database to actually use it in our applications. But for analytics, we use BigQuery.
Awesome. All right, so we just talked about a bunch of different database services that are available to you, and we mentioned some that are cross-cloud, right, or multi-cloud, right? They're not just Amazon options. So This is something I think is a really difficult choice for people who are building new applications. How do you, and not just new applications, but refactoring old ones as well? What do you have to think about, when you're moving to either build a new application or refactor an old application? Like, how do you think about, what you choose for a database, and when is serverless a right choice for you?
We use both AWS and then Google Cloud, but we kind of try to stay in the AWS world when it comes to all of our production data and services and serverless and so on. So first is think which cloud provider is the right for you. I'll go for AWS, but I might be biased there. But then, the way that you have to look at the applications that you have. So if you start with, monolith, and then you want to split it, I would go with serverless, and that's something that we try to do at Trustpilot, to go with serverless-first. So we have this principle that whatever you want to build new or refactor something, you should think of how you can do that in a serverless application, because of all the benefits that you get from using serverless applications, like scalability and price and so on. So I would start with that. Think how you can put your application into a serverless infrastructure. And then, of course, if that's not possible, because there are still limitations on the serverless choices, then we go to containers, so ECS or EKS. And then if that's not the right choice, still the last resort is an EC2 instance, and then you just dump your things there and pay for it because you do that.
Right.
So that's kind of the mindset that we have around when we go for something new or refactoring. And to be honest, now it's almost everything it's serverless when you think about a new building something new, because you have so many tools there that you can get around serverless. But as I said, there are still some limitations that I find, and I'm oh no, it can't be serverless. And you have to go for something else.
Hi everyone, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Epsagon. Epsagon enables teams to instantly simplify, visualize, and understand what's happening with their complex microservice architectures. With their comprehensive, lightweight auto-instrumentation, users are able to eliminate the gaps in data and manual work associated with other APM solutions, providing significant reductions in issue detection, troubleshooting, and resolution times. Epsagon aggregates, unifies, analyzes, and correlates data from all the third-party tools you love, delivering a single pane of glass for understanding serverless, containers, Kubernetes, and more. Engineers now know when something is wrong and can immediately trace issues to root cause before they affect production. Increase developer efficiency and reduce application downtime with Epsagon. And as a special for Serverless Chats listeners, if you try out Epsagon and connect your first trace today, they'll hook you up with one of their awesome t-shirts. Check it out at epsagon.com/serverlesschats. So you mentioned the sort of this process that you use at Trustpilot, and that's super interesting because, again, I always love getting insights into other companies and how they go through these processes. And I know you had mentioned to me in the past your first attempt at moving data into DynamoDB, because that's something you really got to think about, right? I mean, and again, DynamoDB, it's a NoSQL database. You've got to pre-compute a lot of data. You've got to think about your access patterns. So tell that story, because I think that's really interesting, sort of the experience you went through.
Yeah, absolutely. So with DynamoDB, we started to look at it around 2017, when there weren't that many tutorials about it. So we started to look at it. So at that time we had all of our data in MongoDB, and then we're like so used with how the way MongoDB was working, that when we started to look at Dynamo, we're like, what is this all about? Like, what's with this key value store that you're trying to push us to use? And yeah, it wasn't that smooth for us to start using DynamoDB, to be honest. And in the beginning, we're like, yeah, this is just some silly type of database, and we're gonna use it for like, I don't know, some simple scenarios that we have. And yeah, that was the beginning. Like we really didn't think too much about DynamoDB, and now it changed to be our preferred type of data store. So there you have it.
So what's your advice, I guess, out of that? I mean, because again, there are a lot of different options, like you said, learning S3 and figuring out what you can do with that. You don't even use Athena, so knowing how or what you can do in Athena, like, so what's the advice for somebody that wants to make that leap to some sort of serverless database, or Dynamo or Aurora serverless or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely try to get all the information that you can about it, and yeah, look up for tutorials. Nowadays, like, yeah, you can find a lot of information and then start using it, practice, because especially when it comes to DynamoDB, like I mean, it's not that easy to see those patterns, to be honest, especially in the beginning, because if you come, for instance, from a SQL database and you kind of know how to store your data and how your query will look like, your indexes and so on, but then you go to Dynamo where you have a primary key and a sort key and do things with it, and you're like,
Right.
so what can I do with this? So it takes practice. It takes a lot of practice to see the access patterns. And yeah, I would say, like, whenever you have something new that you want to store, like, just give it a try to see how would you do that in Dynamo, and also watch a lot of tutorials from people.
Right.
So yeah, that would be my advice. And when it comes to companies, if you want to push people towards something new, I would say really give them time to adjust.
Yeah.
Because companies trying to say like, oh, DynamoDB will save a lot of money, or serverless, it's saving a lot of money, because they just went to a presentation where they were saying that, and then it's like, yeah, we need to do this, and they expect that overnight, but it's not like that.
Right.
It's like, if you actually want to get the benefits, you need to give people time to actually adjust to whatever new technology you want to adopt.
Right. And that's something I find with DynamoDB too, is you can't just sketch it out and put it in theory. Like, you have to actually start using it. Like, you have to start putting things down, putting data in there, and figure out how you can actually access that, and whether it's going to work for you, what you're trying to do, because you will get your modeling wrong a number of times before you finally get it right. So don't just model something and then throw it into production without going through a number of iterations. It's funny though, because again, I remember way back when, and I'm getting much older than I'd like to admit, but when I first started using SQL, and I was writing, basic select queries and insert, like, fine, easy. I was using SQL Server a lot and MySQL, but you get to a point where, it seems like third normal form and building all these things is just impossible to understand. Like, I mean, it eventually gets to the point where it's very simple to understand once you get it, but it does seem like a daunting thing. Then you make the move to DynamoDB, and I look at how you would structure a relational database, and you're like, wow, that is easy. Like, that's just so simple. Now I've gotten much better with DynamoDB and understanding the patterns, but yeah, it takes an investment. It takes a huge investment for you to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially now that people have experience with other types of database, I think it's even more difficult to make that switch because it is
Right.
quite different and it takes time to see these patterns. And as you said, like you you'll get it wrong many times probably before you get it right. And yeah, you need to start with your queries. You kind of need to do a lot of planning before
Right.
with Dynamo, right? Because you can't just dump your data. You need to do all the planning on like, okay, what I expect. Like everything needs to be planned before you actually do it. But of course, I mean, it's easy now to play with the data and moving it around. Like before was like 2 years to transition from like one table to another, like like
Right.
yeah, it
Right.
was painful, but now you can play with data much easier. So in that terms, yeah, you can practice with Dynamo and see if you can store things in there or not. I would say you can, but it might not be super easy in the beginning.
Right. Yeah. So I think the takeaway here is if you're a company and you're putting stuff into DynamoDB and you get it wrong the first time, you're not alone because we've all done it, right? It's just keep on
Yes.
working on it and you'll get there. You mentioned a little bit about limitations, like you run up against limitations when you're moving things into some sort of serverless database offering, or just serverless in general. I mean, there are limits there. So how important is it to understand those limits? Because I find that they're very high, but when you hit them, they're also very painful.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to, for instance, with Lambda, one of the limitation that I find myself lately hitting it quite a lot is the concurrency. Like I want to, and not just limit the concurrency, but when I limit the concurrency, to not throttle everything that it's
Yeah.
being invoked with, and I know, like I was like, I still, because in my mind was like, yeah, we'll just do this. It's simple. It's serverless. This event is triggering this Lambda, and then this Lambda will call some third-party API. And then we've hit this limitation of which I didn't think about, that like the third-party API had its own limitation, was like, oh, you can only call us 50 times per second. And then
Right.
I was like, oh, how am I doing this with serverless? And I kind of tried to to stay in the serverless world, and like really like move things around, and it got to
Right.
like a super complex solution. And I was like, okay, no, I just need to say no to serverless and move to a container, which will be so much easier to explain to people what I'm doing
Right.
than try to stay in the serverless world. But like I spend a lot of time on like finding a solution there, and yeah, it's good to know the limitations so that you don't just spend a lot of time trying to reinvent things just so that you stay
Right.
serverless.
Yeah.
But yeah, it as you said, like that's one thing that you need to do, like learn the limitations so that you know what you're dealing with. But they are adapting everything and like updating all these things that you kind of need to look at the news all the time. I would say,
Right.
because
Right.
they are constantly working on this. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, and that's one of those things too, where it's like, and you mentioned this, I think, in the beginning, where you said, you get one part of your application, one piece of your architecture that'll scale really well, and then you got other pieces of your architecture that won't. So solving the database problem is really great. I mean, things like Aurora Serverless V2, DynamoDB solve a lot of those. Lambda functions can scale infinitely, whatever they want to do. And then, but then you still have those problems with APIs, right? So you still have to figure out how do you manage those quotas and do that. And I think a lot of people get frequency and concurrency confused, right? So if you have a quota of 200 calls per minute, you can't set your Lambda functions to 200 concurrency, because what if it only takes 2 seconds for that to run? Then you're running,
Exactly.
thousands of invocations against it. So lots of things to think about there. Not necessarily solved yet, but like you said, getting there. So, all right, so let's go back to Trustpilot for a second, because I'm really interested, again, in kind of digging into your architecture and how you solve some of these problems. So let's start, first of all, I mean, you're obviously a huge fan of serverless, right? Which is great. Love serverless, love serverless enthusiasts, especially serverless data enthusiasts. But what about the rest of your organization? Like, how did you bring that in? How did you say, hey, we need to go to a serverless database, or we need to start thinking serverlessly? Like, how did that change happen within your engineering?
Yeah, so it definitely took us time, and we started quite early looking at Lambda functions. And I remember it was after they released or announced it at reInvent, and we had a few colleagues that went there, and when they returned from reInvent, like every time when someone comes from reInvent, they were very excited.
Right.
And they were like, we're going for this. And all of us were like, what's this Lambda function? Leave me alone. I'll just build my application here the way I know. So it took us time. And I think like what helped us was this idea of like, just try using serverless, but you're not forced to use serverless. And we were constantly trying to teach people and constantly talking about the benefits and showing we had people that kind of wanted to use this from the beginning because it was something new. And you always have those people in your companies, right, that they are attracted to whatever is new. So we had people testing out and then sharing with the rest of the company on what they achieved and how it's possible, and then slowly get everyone in the company starting with service architectures, and then that's how we grew. And was the same with the database, the serverless database. We just some teams we tried to use it and then showed the benefits to the rest of the company, and that's how we kind of got everyone to be interested in serverless. And they've seen, so we kind of showed the benefits in our company, not from just general presentations, marketing presentations where this is serverless. This is what you get, no, let's get real. What do you actually get? And that's how we got people excited. And now everyone kind of wants to go to serverless first.
Right. Now, so what about your ops team or your SREs? What was the impact on them?
Oh, I think they loved it the most, I would say, because all of a sudden they didn't get requests oh, can you please give me access to this, or can you create an easy tool for me? And those requests that no one really wants to deal with. So now they can actually focus on building infrastructure that helps us, and building, because before it wasn't about building, it was about supporting developers in doing their job more. And now as a developer, you can do all those things yourself. So the SRE or DevOps team can focus on building
infrastructure
that helps us in different ways.
Right. Yeah. And I know I had a co-location facility for many years, and I would always get the text message at 2 a.m. that a blade went down, or that there was a problem with the SAN disk array or something like that. And you're always driving to the co-location. You have to physically change out hardware. So besides just not having to necessarily do that, I mean, obviously, for me, and I say obviously, but maybe this isn't obvious to people, but since I went serverless, I haven't gotten a single alert at 2 a.m. to say that a server went down or something like that, which made my life a lot better.
Yeah, that's actually right. Since we moved our data and our services as well to serverless, no more like alerts at 2 a.m. To like, oh, you need to scale this database, or like you're having
Right.
problems with this service, you need to provision more. So that's a huge benefit, and I know people that are on call, they appreciate that for sure.
Right.
Like no more midnight calls to do like, yeah, I need to click these 3 buttons, and you're like, oh,
Exactly.
really? Like someone can't do
Yeah.
that automatically, you know?
Yeah, it's a huge. I think it's just a huge morale boost. I mean, and I love that. These are more and more stories of this where you hear that operations people might be sort of nervous, or I guess intimidated by serverless, and then the ones that implement it are like, this is the greatest thing ever, because now I can focus on things that actually matter, which is something that's important, as opposed to, like you said, just doing the daily toil. So let's talk about the Trustpilot architecture, and look at sort of what you have now. I know you gave a presentation a while back. I'm sure things have changed. You probably moved more stuff there, but just what's that typical overview look like? I mean, are you just using DynamoDB, or are you using a sort of a broad range of databases?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I always try to mention when it comes to databases is that you shouldn't put everything in one type, because there are
Right.
so many types of databases, and you need to look at the purpose of that database so that you use the right one for your use case. And yeah, that's what we try and do at Trustpilot. We have data in Dynamo, Aurora, Elastic Cache, Elasticsearch. We still have some data in MongoDB as well, in Redis, and like you name it, like different data source for sure, because we have different use cases, and that's what you have to look at when you choose the data store.
All right. And are you continuing to sort of evolve your architecture and move things away from MongoDB and some of these other sort of non-serverless options?
When it comes to MongoDB, I mean, we've tried to move like a lot of our data from MongoDB because of scaling. So we
Mm-hmm.
moved a lot in Dynamo, but some of the data that we still have in MongoDB, it just makes sense to use MongoDB for the use cases that we have. So that's why we still have some data there. It's still the right choice for us. But who knows? I mean, now we have document database from Amazon, which supports
Right.
MongoDB. So that might be a right solution for us. But yeah, for now, MongoDB works. So we kind of keep the data there, because we've also been in this like continuous refactoring for a very long time.
Right.
So if
Right.
it works, we keep it there for now, you know. Uh, so
Right, and I
yeah.
think though I think that's not uncommon. I mean, it's going to take a while, I think, for people to get everything moved over, and it's really hard when you have something that is running okay and it's working for you and there's not a problem, for you to say, maybe we'll just leave that for now, and then work on some other things. But you're definitely right. Once you have sort of a legacy, a legacy application, it is hard to think about just spending all that time refactoring it just to get the data piece changed, especially if you're not having the performance issues.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is a lot of time that you need to invest to do that, and we've done a lot of it. Not to say that we have invested a lot of time in refactoring because of all the scaling issues that we're having previously. But now that we've hit like a moment where we can breathe a bit in that space, and we can focus on other things. And it's like, okay, let's leave this as it is for a second because it works, and focus
Right.
on other things that might be on fire. And that's the case we have here with MongoDB. Uh, like we don't have that much data left. It's still quite a lot of data there, but it works for now. And like the complexity that we have in there, it doesn't make it so easy to refactor. So that's the reason why right now we are keeping things as they are. with the data that we still have in there.
Hi everyone, I want to take a minute to talk about New Relic. Now I know when it comes to things like observability and tracing, you're probably thinking I should talk about Datadog, Prometheus, or even OpenTelemetry. And a few months ago, I would have totally agreed with you. But New Relic did something a little out there. They literally reworked everything. They've actually been listening when people talk about blind spots, being stuck with a dozen different tools, or getting hit with hidden costs. So first, they went open source, making it so that you can actually instrument whatever you need. Then they made it so that you can monitor your whole entire stack in one place, including your serverless workloads. You can use telemetry data from any source for ridiculously cheap, and there's just one UI with all the tools you need. Plus, they completely changed their pricing to a consumption-based model so that you can easily predict your bill. Now, I love this pricing model because it scales as my cloud application scales, which feels a lot like serverless to me. And best of all, there's a perpetual free tier with one user and 100 gigabytes per month totally free. You can try it and make sure that it works for you before it costs you anything. So if you want observability made simple, New Relic is definitely worth another look. Check out their new platform at newrelic.com. All right, so I love to talk theory, and a lot of what we talked about, I think, will help people. But what about actual, like, real world stuff? So let's talk about an example. I know you have a couple of examples here, but what are some of the problems that you were having? Because again, if it's working, maybe we don't need to invest the money. But when we start to have problems with things, we need to think about refactoring those and maybe taking a serverless approach. At least that's how I think about it. So I know you've done this a few times at Trustpilot. So what's a practical example? What was a problem that you solved with serverless, that made it the right choice?
Well, it's all about scalability. To be honest, that was one real problem that we're having with scaling the database, the Mongo database. And to be honest, some of the issues were because of the way that we configured things and the way that we stored. An exact example for this one was in the beginning, we're storing all of our data into one cluster in MongoDB. And then, like, whenever you were putting a lot of pressure on one data point, the entire cluster would fail. So all the applications that were using that data were down. So we changed that in Mongo, but then still, like, scaling was a real problem for us, and the company has grown a lot. That's why we knew we had to do something, and that's why DynamoDB is definitely the right choice for us, because it's scalable, and we know, and I shouldn't say we know, but we definitely hope that the company will grow even more, that makes it the right choice, because I don't see the need of refactoring again what we have in Dynamo, for instance, because I know it can handle the scale, even though it might double. It can still handle it. So that makes it a great choice for us, because, as I said, we've been in this refactoring mode for a long period. We've been changing from, like, MySQL database on-premise to MySQL database in the cloud, then from MySQL to Mongo. So much refactoring that now that I can say, like, we have data in Dynamo, and I don't see the necessity of switching to something else because of scaling issues. It makes it just perfect, I would say.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned in that talk that you gave, this idea of the user signups and expirations on, I think, was it like temporary accounts and things like that? Yes. So that was one of the big things. Was that one of the things you moved from Mongo to DynamoDB?
That was one example. So the scenario was that we have so people can sign up, but then they have to activate their account, and that's quite like a normal scenario, right? So they have to activate, and if they don't activate in like 30 days, then we need to delete the account. And we're doing that in our only Mongo database where we're keeping all the data for consumers. And of course, we're putting a lot of load, unnecessary load on our primary database. So we decided to actually take this entire scenario out, and we started using events. When a consumer will sign up, we'll send an event to store some data in a DynamoDB, which would say this consumer sign up, and then we'll have another event coming from the activate, like the activation API, saying this consumer activated. So then we'll delete the data in this DynamoDB, and we had one DynamoDB with all the unactivated accounts, and then from there we could look at like when the account was created, and we can delete whatever accounts that are not activated in time. So this way we took that whole like pipeline to serverless in its own context, like its own service, and then doing its thing there separate from our primary data. And we did it with like 2 events and DynamoDB, and then another Lambda that was listening to was querying this database. So it was a very simple scenario, but we took a lot of load from the main database by not going like every day would query the database to get like all unactivated accounts. So it was a very simple scenario, but like this just shows how you don't have to like refactor your whole database. You can just take parts of it, or like queries, like whatever. Like this was like just a scenario, and we took it out in its own thing. It's doing its thing. I haven't checked it in like a very long time because it's just working, Now I'm thinking maybe I should go and check it. No, but like that's like one example where, as I said, like you don't have to refactor the entire thing. You can just take part of it.
Yeah, and one thing that I love about that example is I think a lot of people will think, oh, if I want to tack on or I want to go serverless, that I've got to somehow re-engineer my existing application. And that's this perfect example. Like, think if you got flooded with a bot or some sort of attack or something like that was just adding new accounts and adding new accounts. It's not even touching your Mongo database, right? Because it's all getting buffered in this DynamoDB table that is going to scale. And then unless it's activated, right, then those events don't get passed through. So you're taking off all kinds of load. You're making your primary database that is already scalable but maybe can't handle those transactions or that number of transactions. You're offloading all of that. And that's just a perfect example. I love that. I mean, it's great. Great. I think anybody could use that exact same scenario for their signups right now and take a ton of load off that database. And like you said, just the maintenance of having to query through a MongoDB and look for the accounts that weren't activated yet. That's just a waste. I mean, that's a complete waste. And with DynamoDB, were you just using like the TTL to expire unactivated accounts?
Yeah. So that's like I remember in the presentation when I was presenting this scenario, I gave like 2 options, because one is to look at the just have a cron job that will trigger your Lambda to like query the DynamoDB based on the data that you have in there. But the other one is to just store an expiration, like expired, because like your accounts will expire in 30 days, for instance, and then you can use a TTL to expire those items, and then you can use the stream to trigger a Lambda with that data, for instance. So that's another way of looking at this. So you have multiple choices. That's a good scenario to be in, and it depends on what you're doing, right? Because remember, on streams it will trigger any kind of activity. And in our case, we only cared about expired. So I think we just went for a cron job in this instance. But it was possible to filter what kind of events the stream will send. Definitely TTL would have been the right approach for us.
Right. I mean, and even getting them in batches, I think the TTL approach would be interesting because then you could have that stream every time an account wasn't activated, you could forward that off to S3 or something like that so that you could store a record of the accounts that never were activated, have all kinds of data on that, but not have it in the operational database, which again is another really, I guess, a good pattern to use in serverless, right? Is to say, the things that need to be in operational databases, store those in operational databases. The things that can be stored for reporting and for, data lake analytics and that kind of stuff, put those in another place like S3 or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty with serverless, that you can split things, and you should split things. Like all of these, as you say, like keep your like main database doing what's important for you, but all these like extra scenarios, put them outside and have them on their own. So they just work on their little things, and they are very good at doing that thing, right? That's right. That's the beauty with serverless, and it's something that people should consider, and not just put everything in one solution and build like a monster.
Awesome. Well, that's some pretty good advice to end with. Angela, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Super informative stuff. If people want to find out more about you, connect with you, how do they do that?
So I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn by using my name, or on Twitter also by using my name. And I'll be happy to talk more about databases, serverless, or whatever, anything else.
Awesome.
Just use my name.
All right, and so and Trustpilot, trustpilot.com if you want to check that out and sign up there. So I will get all that in the show notes. Thanks again, Angela.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Angela Timofte for being my guest this week, and to our sponsors New Relic and Epsagon. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/79. For more serverless chats, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily, and if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.